Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Are you able to hear me today? Welcome to today's webinar. Um, Before we start, I'd just like to do a quick audio video um, check. Can you hear and see me? Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Thanks, Mary. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. Indeed you joined through the the host link. Oh, good. Um, let's get started. So, like I said, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. The topic for today is going to be around how to we're going to walk you through a step-by-step approach on how to set and interpret your baseline for your fleet emissions. This is a 30-minute webinar. I'm monitoring the chat at the same time. For those of you who are not English speakers and you would like to listen to the webinar in a different language, you will see. Just give me 1 second. Let me copy. 1 second. I'm gonna post a link in the chat, which you can also use to. Wait. You should be seeing an app called Worldly where you can have the possibility to yes to listen to this webinar with captions in a language of your choosing. So feel free to use that and join in for the webinar today. Like I said, it's a 30-minute webinar. I've prepared some interesting messages for you today. And we are going to, you can of course raise questions in the chat box. I'm monitoring the chat box. Feel free to introduce yourself. I see Deborah has done so already. Fantastic. And Ernest as well. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, your name, the organization, and the country that you are based in. So let's begin. Uh, Emissions baseline. So I'm not sure if you heard, if this is your first webinar for the year, that maybe allow me to just tell you a little bit about what you're seeing on my screen at the moment. So last year, the Fleet Forum community, Fleet Forum is a membership organization. We have over 40 members, and it's a mix of NGOs, UN agencies, Red Cross and Red Crescent movement organizations. And so our members came together, and as you might know, many organizations have a very big ambitions around sustainability, right? And in particular, environmental sustainability and what we would like to achieve. So we brought together our member organizations to have a discussion and make some concrete commitments around what can we as a sector achieve in terms of the reduction of fleet emissions. And what you're seeing on my screen is the commitments that our member organizations made. And the first one is the one that I'm going to be zooming into today, which is around setting a baseline and targets for the largest fleets in our organization, representing at least 50% of the fleet in its totality. And to do this by the end of Q3 this year. So I'm sure some of you are joining in today also, maybe from the perspective of the commitments, or maybe just from a curiosity on how to set a baseline, right? So this is the focus of today's webinar. Now, you will probably hear us, or you might have seen this visual before. We're going to keep using it in our different Fleet Forum activities because it's a strong representation of how we would like you to think about the reduction and the overall footprint of your fleet, which is start with always with seeing what trips you can avoid. Though once you have avoided as much as possible, you're shifting then to more environmentally friendly modes. And then when you have also shifted as much as possible, you are looking at improving the efficiency of your existing transport modes. That's not to say that you cannot work at multiple activities at once, but what I try to show you with this slide is that it's important to prioritize activities in the avoid area, not only focus on improve, to really work your way through this in terms of prioritization from left to right. And if we look at baseline setting, I would say that comes maybe even potentially before avoiding, right? Because after all, you might have heard a very famous management guru once said, you can't measure you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So setting a baseline is important to get an insight into if you want to reduce, you need to know first what is your current state, what is your baseline of your emissions. And so your baseline can really give you an understanding of where to start, right? And to also draw a line in the sand in terms of, okay, this is the target we want to achieve. So how do you go about that, right? On my screen, you are seeing 5 key steps to creating a baseline. I borrowed this visual from a peer organization. And what I'd like to show you with this is that the way you go about setting your baseline is first you start with understanding like, okay, your overall corporate target, right? In terms of your if there is already a wider target in your organization in terms of reducing the environmental footprint. So maybe you might see in your organization that there is already an ambition around the reduction of fleet emissions. So it starts with getting an overall view of what are the targets in your organization and to think and to start getting some idea of what are your fleet activities, right? And capturing some basic data. Then you move on to setting a baseline, to measuring. You use your data to get an understanding of and make an estimation of what your fleet emissions are. After that, you are setting a reachable target that will help you understand, okay, how ambitious you're going to be, how does this fit with the overall ambition of your organization, and it also helps you with the selection of initiatives in the future. And then lastly, you have engage your stakeholders and to actually implement the actions. I say these in a smaller voice, not because they are not important, but because today I really want to focus on steps 1, 2, and 3, which is the purpose of this webinar, right? But of course, if you've watched our previous webinars, you know that we also talk about stakeholder engagement, and change management can make or break the implementation of your improvement programs, and that applies as well to fleet sustainability. So let's talk about establishing your baseline, right? You might have heard the terms scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. For those of you in the chat, can I maybe ask you a quick question, and please type to share your answer. Do you have a baseline of your emissions today? I'm looking for a yes, no. And those of you who say yes, can you say if your baseline for your emissions is on scope 1, 1 and 2, or 1, 2, 3? No, that's a pretty straightforward answer, Jen. Okay, yes, scope 1. So, okay, let's keep a few more colleagues. I know you're all alive and kicking. Mary says 1. Okay, CRS has a target 1, 2, 3. No. Okay. All 3 scopes. Okay. A few more colleagues. Let's see. No. Okay. Alrighty. So what I first want to show you over here is that it's important whether you are a fleet manager or a sustainability focal point, no matter where you are in the organization, right? It's important to understand the difference. Though difficult, I understand what. So it's important to understand what do these scopes actually mean, right? And what are we talking about when we say scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? So let me walk you through that in a little bit of depth. It's important as the fleet manager, if you're going to be the one or even the sustainability focal point in your organization who's looking at this, then you should have a good understanding of what these scopes actually mean. And that's what I try to visualize on this slide for you. So your direct and your scope 1, 2, and 3, in essence, it's about your direct and your indirect emissions in relation to your fleet. And these are key metrics really. So you need to understand where your greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. So scope 1, these are the direct emissions that are owned or controlled by an organization. So in the context of fleet, what this means is that you probably have owned vehicles, or maybe you have rented vehicles. Now I'm talking specifically about internal combustion engine vehicles. Here they're probably using fuel. So here your scope 1 fleet emissions are all the emissions that are generated, the greenhouse gas emissions specifically. There's CO2 emissions, that you are more familiar with this term probably, that are emitted as a result of you operating your fleet and burning fuel to make the vehicles run, both for your owned and for your rented. Then there's the scope 2 emissions. This covers your indirect emissions from purchase sources. So this is about like the electricity maybe your fleet is consuming if you have how do I say electric or hybrid vehicles in your fleet. So here in particular, we are talking about the electricity that is purchased to power your owned and rented hybrid and electric vehicles. That's scope 2. And then lastly, scope 3 is it's a wide range of subcategories, as you probably saw from Juan's message. It's about it includes the upstream supply chain, but also the downstream supply chain. And I think in the context of fleet, what's important to understand here is that it includes commuting, it includes cargo transport, it includes the waste that is generated from your fleet. It includes the production and disposal of the vehicles that you are owning and operating. So it's quite a broader category. We have less influence over these, but that's why we call them indirect. But that doesn't mean it's not possible to have an impact on the reduction of these, right? So but these are the emission. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and establishing a baseline, that's why I asked you for which scope have you set this, because for scope 1, you require not too much data, but then of course for scope 2 and scope 3, you do require more data. So my first tip for you for today is those of you who've said, okay, I don't have a baseline on my emissions, I would highly encourage you to start at least with setting a baseline on your fleet emissions, specifically on scope 1. All you really need is the liters of petrol and diesel that your fleet is consuming on an annual basis. That already is enough to make a calculation and to make an estimate and to make an estimate on the baseline of your fleet emissions. So that's in a nutshell what establishing your baseline entails. And you might say, Nikita, but how do I go about setting that? In case you check in your organization, you might already even have tools that you can access to establish your baseline. But in the event that you do not have that, you can use the Clean Fleet Toolkit. I'm just dropping a link in the chat in case you would like to access it. It's available in English, in French. You can also, if you've got Google Translate enabled in your browser, you can translate it in more languages, and it's publicly available. You can also make an account if you're a Fleet Forum member and you can save your data then. But in essence, it is a publicly available tool and you can use it to set a baseline on your fleet emissions for scopes 1, 2, and 3. So that is a little bit about setting your baseline. Now, let's say once you have your baseline, right? Check. You have your baseline, which I hope those of you who said no today, I'm not going to do name calling today, colleagues, but those of you who said no, I really hope you can take some time this week. Like I said, very minimal data inputs you need to already set a baseline. It's not a very complicated exercise. But let's say once you have your baseline, right? You will now have an idea of where most of your emissions lie. Now, I'm referring to those of you who decide to use some more data and also get more detailed insight. I've put the visual on the left of you might see a picture over here. It says figure 11. Here, what I want you to look at, right, is please don't pay attention too much to what the type of vehicle is. But I think the reason why I chose this visual for this webinar today is I want you to see that when you make a proper baseline of your fleet emissions, you will get some insights, for example, around where are most of your emissions? Is it in the production? Is it in the operation of the fleet? Is it in the disposal? So we supported our colleagues at CORD and KLU. We worked together with them as well as some member organizations last year to do a life cycle assessment of a range of vehicles. And what we see and what you see here is this is an example where when you do when you do a baseline, and especially for all three scopes, you can get some insight into where most of your emissions are. In this case, in the operations. So that means there's quite a lot that we can do. Sometimes we're thinking a lot on the production of the vehicles, but there are even what we are seeing in this visual is there are a lot of emissions in the operations of the vehicles itself. And then as we conduct our baseline, we'll also get some more insight into, like, for example, when you use the Clean Fleet Toolkit, you not only see in which scope most of your emissions lie, but you can also see things like what is it based on what types of vehicles, what are the most polluting types of vehicles in your fleet. You can also, if you do your own analysis, you can check and see are more of your emissions coming from your own vehicles or from your rental vehicles. So there's a number of different things that you can do. And you can then use this information as well to create some what if scenarios that can help you potentially set a target. And what you're seeing on my screen is I've given you some tips of the types of scenarios you can consider. So once you've set your baseline, you could do a what if scenario and say, okay, what would happen if 15% of our trips, or you can even take the kilometers, right, from these trips, what if we would reduce the number of kilometers we drove by 15%? Because we would implement a policy that would have to do with more virtual working and so forth. What would that do to our emissions? Would it reduce it by also by 15%, by more, by less? So that's one thing. Another scenario, and there's a number of other scenarios you can run, right? Like, for example, what if I'm assuming now your utilization on average of your fleet is 8,000, and you could run a scenario where you think, okay, what if we start to do better planning of our trips, which means we could, instead of having, I don't know, we could 100 vehicles, we would be able to try to have fewer vehicles but run more kilometers with those vehicles. So here is another what if scenario. What if you move from 8,000 to 11,000 and you reduce the fleet size accordingly because you move the trips to increase the utilization of your fleet? Another example is, what if you drove 45% of your kilometers in smaller vehicles, in this case sedans, instead of 4x4s? Or what if you reduced, this is more, the last one is more if you are using like GPS tracking, sorry, vehicle tracking systems, and you have some insight. What if you reduced your idling time by 20%? What would that do to your current fleet emissions? So what if scenarios there's probably more scenarios. This is just an example for you to get some ideas. But when you run these types of scenarios, you can get some insight into potentially how much could you reduce your fleet emissions. And that's an important insight to have because that will then feed into your target setting. So let's take a look at that. This is something I would like to share with you today as well. Let me go one step back and ask colleagues in the webinar today. Those of you who said you do have a baseline, or actually some of you might not even have the baseline, but still have a target. So let me ask you, how many of you have a target? So I'm looking for a yes, no question on your fleet emissions, yeah? And if you do have a target for your fleet emissions, could you share in the chat box what is the target, please? I see some of you are starting to dig into your documents thinking, wait, I know I had a target, but I'm not sure what it is. Let me check quickly. I'm joking, colleagues, but you are very quiet. I'm looking for some typing. Let me give it a couple of seconds. I'll just repeat the question in case you didn't hear it. Do you have a target to reduce your fleet emissions specifically? Not your overall emissions in your organization, your fleet emissions. Yes, no, and if yes, what is the target? Hey, there we go. Okay, the internet started to work again. So, or we are waking up. No target yet. We are still at the baseline. Okay. Concern worldwide Malawi, 25% by 2027. Okay. Emmabet, you said yes. Can you say what the target is? Sam, yes, targeted reduction in fuel consumption by 10% equivalent to 50,000 liters less. Okay, okay. Thank you, colleagues. So, and some of you are saying no. If you, Tony and Sam, if you allow me to use your two examples, right? One of you have said, okay, 25% by 2027. One of you have said target a reduction in fuel consumption. So it's really, and I wanted to ask this question because it will help you understand my next slide, which is when you are setting a target, there are different types of targets that you can set. And it's important to, again, check first overall in your organization, what is the approach to target setting? Here, I'm going to walk you through three different approaches that I'm familiar with. I'm not a target setting expert, colleagues, but we are doing more and more research in this area, and I want to bring this to you. So first, we have what we call the absolute emission reduction target setting approach, which is, I think, I could be wrong, but I think Tony's example of our colleagues from Concern in Malawi is probably an example of an absolute emission target, reduction target, sorry, which is to set a goal that has to do with reducing by a specific amount or a specific percentage based on considering your baseline year. So indeed, it's like I want to reduce my fleet emissions by 20% from the baseline year of this year of 2020, and I want to reduce that by 2030. So this is an absolute emission reduction target. And the benefit of this is that it's very straightforward and easy to how do you say, not to set, but it's simple, right? Like if I tell you that, it's like, okay, so I had 100 in this year, I will reduce by 80%. So in 2030, I will have 80. Yeah. So that's what I mean by straightforward and simple. Now, the downside of this is that if your activities are growing, or likewise, if they are reducing, then it doesn't really tell you if you are becoming more efficient. Because if your activities are growing, you have to manage it, but if you don't manage it, naturally they will go up automatically. And similarly, if your activities are reducing, you will achieve the target, yes, but it's not because you have taken deliberate efforts to optimize your fleet. So there's some pros and cons to this approach. Another approach to contrast it with is around an intensity target. So this is about reducing your emissions relative to a specific metric. So it can be per vehicle, per kilometer driven, per unit of cargo, or more importantly, and I think this is one where we want to encourage you more and more to think about, which is, for example, you can set a target saying, I'm going to reduce my CO2 emissions per passenger by 15%. So this one, it's a bit contrasting to the previous approach, which is it's more flexible. It allows you to, if your fleet expands if your operational activities go down, this was really focused on yes, on how do I say this? On making sure that it really looks at how you are optimizing and making efficient your activities. On the other side of it, it might not actually lead to a absolute reduction, right? If your activities grow, you might still end up having more emissions, even though you are being a little bit more efficient. So that's an intensity target. And then we have what we call an activity-based target, which I think is more closer to what Sam is sharing, which is, okay, target a reduction of fuel consumption, for example, or reduce the idling time by X%. What this one is about, it's setting targets based on the specific activities or operations in your fleet. And the benefit of this approach is that you really focus on specific, when you set targets like this, you have given some time to think, if this is my emissions, what are the initiatives that are really going to help me reduce? And to then set targets around those initiatives or activities. So it gives you a more precise focus on implementing initiatives that would deliver a reduction in emissions. I'm not here today to tell you which approach is better or worse, but because like I said, we're at the start of this journey and we're all learning. But I did want to at least give you some time to think today that there are different ways, especially those of you who are in the process of setting your emissions, that there's different ways to go about it. I've got a couple more slides for you. You might be wondering, okay, how much can I actually reduce my emissions by, right? Realistically, Nikita, if I'm setting a target, should I say 2%? Should I say 10%? Should I say the 50, 60%? I'm going to be very honest with you, it's not such a straightforward question because the reduction of your emissions is really going to depend based on the circumstances of your fleet, where you're operating, the types of vehicles, the age of the vehicles, your current mileage. So it's, I don't have a one, how do you say, a clear one size fits all answer for you. But and in the humanitarian sector, there isn't a lot of data around this. Like you're seeing in the chat today, many of us are just starting on this journey. But we can look at least maybe to the commercial sector for some thought, food for thought, or a potential point of comparison. And what we see, at least in the commercial sector, is that in the ideal scenario, the CO2 emissions organizations are able to reduce it by as much as 40% over a 4-year period. And in global organizations, they are setting an overall target, but then country by country or region by region, depending on where you are based, they are also looking at more localized strategies for implementation. Like you might have seen with us when we talk about electric vehicles, we've said, okay, electric vehicles is part keyword one of the activities in your sustainability strategy, but they might not work in every operating context at the moment, right? So this is where localized strategies really make a difference and so you need to have a global target, but you also need to have localized strategies for implementation. And another point I want to bring across is what we see in the commercial sector. So electrification is emerging as a bigger and bigger topic. But I think that also depends on an organization by organization basis. I think for the humanitarian sector, what's most relevant is to think, okay, yes, we can test out electric vehicle technologies, as you've said, and that's part of it. But equally important is there are many other powerful initiatives we could be looking at. And these are the ones you're seeing on my screen, right? Reducing the need for travel, looking at vehicle sharing, reviewing our mileage patterns to downsize or to down profile the fleet, reduce the number of vehicles we have smaller vehicles, implement correct preventative maintenance and repair practices, eco driving. So there's a number of different things that we could be that we should be looking at. That's what I would like you to take into consideration. Um, we have a few more minutes. Let's open the floor for some conversations and questions. Colleagues, I think I mentioned at the start of the webinar, but if I didn't, I'm sorry. This is your moment to raise some questions, and I'm going to look at a couple of comments in the meantime. So, Carl, you say FAO has an overall strategy of 45% reduction, okay, from air travel and non-air travel. However, our fleet unit has not set the baseline yet. Fully understand, Carl. This is exactly why. Very happy you're here. Like I said, I would encourage you summarizing what we discussed in the webinar today. Start with the baseline. You probably have a rough indication of how many vehicles FAO is operating. Maybe by now, with the data you started collecting, you might have some insight into how many kilometers, like what is the overall fuel consumption. And okay, it's an estimate, it's not perfect, but I would say you are probably getting into a position where you can set at least a baseline of the fleet emissions, right? And then potentially to run some what if scenarios, you can pick maybe work with a handful of countries that have some more data, look at the scenarios I was discussing, maybe consider some more as well. And that might give some food for thought on like, can we apply that same 45% reduction that FAO has said? Is there more to be gained, less to be gained? I'm really curious to see how FAO approaches this. And Juan, you mentioned, I guess, an initial target for the next 2 to 3 years will be good to start moving. I fully agree. I do. I do. Uh, I see a colleague has asked, what are you finding are the main justifications for idling? I think what we've seen, at least in every now and then we hear from some colleagues that, okay, there is a security justification for idling, but I would argue like I understand that that is probably the case and there are some good reasons for it, but indeed it's important to make sure idling is an area also where we could look at more proactively, right? And that starts by looking at what is our idling frequency, to properly use the data from our vehicle tracking systems and to then set targets around the reduction of this. I'm not seeing any more questions. We more responsive and provide a service, Sam said. I'm seeing some colleagues say, okay, hello, our fleet has not set the baseline, but we have new vehicles in our cluster. Ernest, like I said, target setting, key first step. First step, you only need the liters of petrol and diesel. Khalas, that's all you need. It's very easy to set a baseline for scope 1 emissions. And I would highly encourage to start there. And Sam, you mentioned we are more responsive and we provide a service, so we are unable to control the demand much. This affects our targets. I would, that is why I said I would really encourage you not that, and that's actually why I brought in this slide on the types of targets. If you say, we don't, our demand is changing a lot, and that then I would really look at having an intensity-based or an activity-based target. But it is still possible to set targets no matter whether your operations are growing or downsizing. Yeah. Ernest, you've asked how can we calculate the CO2 daily? Um, it is possible. You can take, like I said, if you're monitoring your fuel consumption on a daily basis. I know some of our Fleet Forum members some of our commercial members, our supplier members who are using they are providers of tracking devices or fleet management systems. They have like whenever an organization is providing data on their fuel consumption, they are making an estimate for them on the CO2 emissions. I think the more important part I want to share with you here, Ernest, is that you need to look at the broader trend, right? And what's happening around that. And earlier in the chat, I posted a link. I'll just post it here at the bottom once again. Please feel free to use the Clean Fleet Toolkit that can give you some insight also into your fleet emissions. Colleagues, I see we've run out of time. I really hope this webinar gave you some new thoughts, particularly in terms of what to do once you've set a baseline, how to interpret it, what types of targets you could be setting. I hope it gave you some food for thought. Please feel free to join our webinar. We have one taking place on the 27th of March. That is next week. Oh, time's flying. And we're going to be talking about fleet waste, also an important category and very much contributing to our fleet emissions as well. So thank you all for joining. We will share the webinar recording. Feel free to use the Clean Fleet Toolkit. And in case you have any questions or comments or suggestions for follow-up webinars on this topic, we are happy to hear. Yes. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.